Thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. Can I say what a pleasure it is to join such a distinguished panel of experts in Sam and Ali and Umar? And on behalf of the Labour Party, can I take this opportunity to congratulate the campaign against the arms trade, Emma Watana, for human rights on your nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, due to be announced in October. We all know dozens of people and organizations are put forward each year for a Nobel Peace Prize, some very deserving and some very undeserving. But you can always tell whether a nomination is serious, who is responsible for putting it forward. So when we see far-right MPs from Italy and Norway putting forward the likes of Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu for the 2021 Peace Prize, we know those nominations can just be dismissed as offensive jokes, the offensive jokes that they are. But when we see the international Quaker movement, who know all about global struggle for peace, putting forward CAAT and Watana for their work on the Yemen conflict and on the judicial review into UK arms sales, then that is true recognition of the global impact that your work has had. And I want to join the Quaker movement in congratulating both organisations for those efforts and in wishing you well at the prize event in October. I was reflecting yesterday that it's been 5 years since I became Shadow Foreign Secretary, shortly before Boris Johnson took over the job on the other side. And I sat down that day 5 years ago and wrote out what would be my 4 priorities in terms of where I wanted to focus. I wanted to focus my pressure on the government. And I wrote down, number 1 was Brexit, number 2 was human rights, 3, climate change, and 4 was Yemen. And then that November, I added number 5, which was Donald Trump. And the reason I focused on those priorities is because they were the areas where, to my mind, fundamental deceits were being practiced on the British people and on Parliament in terms of what the government was saying, compared either to what they were doing or compared to the reality of the situation. And in the case of Yemen, compared to both. And when you look back on the last 5 years of UK statements on Yemen, you can see a true catalogue of deceit, with the government story shifting each time some new truth was uncovered or each time some potential liability needed to be hedged off. Remember just some of the rows of the past 5 years with the British government over basic issues of fact. First, they said cluster bombs were not being used, then that they were being used, but they weren't British made. And finally, that they were UK made, but several years old. And then we had the assurance that Saudi airstrikes were not affecting civilians because we were told UK personnel were in the room helping with the targeting. And then that story changed rapidly and we were told UK personnel were in the next room giving advice on targeting. And finally, it changed totally and we were told UK personnel was nowhere near the room and were not involved in targeting at all. And remember the promises we were given, that a full assessment had been conducted, concluding that the Saudis were not violating international law, followed by a change in the record saying that no such assessment had been carried out. All this confusion spread to New York, where 1 week in October 2016, The Guardian was briefed that a draft UN resolution had been circulated by the UK delegation proposing an immediate ceasefire on all sides and an independent investigation of all war crimes, followed a fortnight later by ministers questioning whether such a resolution existed and agreeing with the Saudi ambassador to the UN that even if it did exist, it certainly was no longer required. And throughout this time, we have gone through the usual routine in relation to each individual bombing in Yemen, the pictures of devastation and death emerging from the ground, followed by the angry denials that Saudi planes were responsible, followed by the insistence that the target was legitimate, followed eventually, and in some cases, by the grudging acceptance that there may have been a mistake. And of course, as we all know very well, the icing on this very rotten cake, when it comes to the duplicity of ministers, came as a result of the Court of Appeal's ruling in 2019, when in the space of a year, we went from ministers insisting that it was not possible for them to carry out their own investigations into the circumstances of individual airstrikes in Yemen, to them suddenly being able to carry out precisely those kinds of investigations, just so that they could declare that all the risks had been properly assessed and that it was safe to resume the sale of arms. Liz Truss looked me square in the eye over the dispatch box in the House of Commons, and she insisted that while isolated incidents had taken place where international law may have been broken, that because these took place, quote, at different times and in different circumstances and for different reasons, they did not amount to a pattern of behaviour. There was no basis on which to conclude, she said, that Saudi Arabia lacked, quote, either the intent or the capacity to comply with international law. She told me the conclusions of her department's investigations and analysis were sufficiently robust to set aside the ruling of the Court of Appeal. And yet, to this day, she refuses to publish those investigations or the department's analysis. She refuses to say which incidents it examined or which were deemed to be isolated examples where international law was breached. She refuses even to say how many such incidents there were, so that we can know how she defines the term isolated. She has refused to explain how the United Nations panel of experts could review exactly the same evidence and emerge with precisely the opposite conclusion, particularly when it comes to a pattern of behaviour. She has refused to explain how the systematic destruction of Yemen's farmland, food processing plants, fishing boats, and markets throughout 2016 did not constitute a pattern, let alone the surge in targeting of buses and cars in 2018. And of course, she has refused to explain how she can square her insistence that the Saudi coalition has the intent and capacity to comply with international law, with its proven use of child soldiers, with its torture and sexual abuse of detainees, and with its use of starvation and siege tactics as weapons of war. I have stood at that dispatch box in Westminster opposite Liz Truss, just as I did opposite Boris Johnson, and before him Michael Fallon. And in all of those debates, I have tried appealing to their sense of logic and reason. I have tried appealing to their sense of legal responsibility. And at times, I have even tried appealing to their sense of morality and decency, and the feelings that they must have surely of conscience and shame. These surely must lie somewhere deep within them, when they know that their decisions are responsible for the deaths of innocent children in Yemen. But all that has stared back at me are the cold, callous eyes of individuals who could not care less about any of those appeals and cannot see past the pound signs on the bottom of the export license forms that when they are put in front of them to sign. I've seen nothing like it during my time in politics. I've seen similar elsewhere in my life during my early years of my legal career in the 80s. I saw it when I was representing striking miners one week and gay men being prosecuted for indecency the next. And from the police forces I dealt with, I saw the same look in their eyes, not interested in logic or reason or truth or morality, not bothered by appeals to their conscience, just the cold, callous indifference of men who had decided the outcome already and wouldn't let anything get in their way. And believe me, going up against the government for the last 5 years on Yemen has been much worse than going up against corrupt police forces in the 1980s. And it has provoked much greater rage in me, because then it was a matter of blatant disregard for justice that could profoundly affect someone's life. But it rarely ended it. But I'm here to tell you tonight that that is why this work means everything and why your work is so important. Let me give you this message to everyone who is working at the campaign against the arms trade and Watana, and everyone who is supporting your work and watching this evening online. You are the answer to everything that I have just said about the attitude of the British government and the callous indifference of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss to what is happening in Yemen. They're never going to change their position now. They're never going to stop selling arms for the use in this horrific conflict. They're never going to end the suffering that their indifference allows to continue. They're never going to do any of that unless they are forced to do so by the British courts, or failing that, by the court of public opinion. And that is why everything that you're doing to win this judicial review, to persuade more members of the public to sign up to this campaign is so vitally important. I've spent 5 years leading the campaign in Parliament, along with the likes of Keith Vaz and Andrew Mitchell, and we will keep doing our utmost at every chance that we get. But I know that it is your work that will make the most difference in the end. Because as I found in the 80s, when you can't persuade others by appealing to logic or truth or morality, the only way that you can win the argument is by appealing to the law and winning your case in open court. And that's what you're doing, and you will continue to have my full support. And when you succeed, as I'm confident that you will so deserve that Nobel Peace Prize. And more than that, you will have taken a giant step to the prize that we are all pursuing, which is an end to the sale of arms for this terrible war, and a final end to the war itself, and an end to the suffering of the Yemeni people. Thank you.